The Precious Metals Week in Review, January 15th, 2016. Brought to you by Precious Metals International. It was another hectic week for stock markets as Asian markets, particularly in China, continued to tumble. The S&P 500 dropped below its August lows on Friday, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 500 points at one point on continued concern over the state of Asian economies and the global economic impact of the continued slide in oil prices. The number of Americans filing new claims for state unemployment benefits unexpectedly jumped by 7,000 claims last week to a new seasonally adjusted level of 284,000 claims. The previous week's data was unrevised. As is usual for this time of year, the weekly unemployment data is likely to be volatile for the next several weeks. The warmer than usual winter could also be throwing off the seasonal adjustment factors that the Labor Department uses to adjust the data. Chinese stock markets officially entered bear market territory this week, dropping over 20% lower from their most recent highs amid continued concerns over the ongoing economic slowdown in China. The yuan, also known as the renminbi, continued to show weakness against the US dollar, and one economist at French bank Societe Generale believes a continued fall in the yuan will trigger global deflation and send the S&P tumbling to fresh lows. Albert Edwards, who is notoriously bearish in his research notes, said in his latest note this week that U.S. quantitative easing, may not have done much to boost U.S. growth, but it certainly inflated global asset prices into the stratosphere. If I am right, the S&P would fall to 550, a 75% decline from the recent 2,100 peak. That obviously will be a catastrophe for the economy via the wealth effect, and all the Fed's QE hard work will turn dust. South Korea renewed propaganda broadcasts via loudspeakers across its borders with North Korea, after the belligerent North conducted a self-described H-bomb test. Kim Ki-nam, the head of the ruling Workers' Party propaganda department in North Korea, said this week that the propaganda broadcasts, combined with stepped-up military activity following the H-bomb test, was pushing the situation to the brink of war. Mr. Kim said at a rally on Friday, "Jealous of the successful test of our first H-bomb, the U.S. and its followers are driving the situation to the brink of war by saying they have resumed psychological broadcasts and brought in strategic bombers." In Japan, core machinery orders fell by 14.4%, the largest drop in a year and a half. The data is largely viewed as a leading indicator for capital spending in Japan over the next 6 to 9 months, and the large plunge could mean further economic slowdown in Japan is in the near future. Economists had predicted a decline in machinery orders of roughly half that amount month on month, and the larger than expected drop could mean that the economic slowdown in China is spreading into surrounding economies faster than expected. Indonesia's capital city of Jakarta was rocked this week as explosions and gunfire erupted in a clearly coordinated terrorist attack. The Islamic State, ISIS, immediately claimed responsibility for the attacks, which lasted for hours, left 7 dead and more than 20 others injured. The attackers showed a high degree of coordination and sophistication, and the events could signal that ISIS may be setting its sights on Southeast Asia as it moves to expand its global reach. ISIS also claimed responsibility for a suicide bomb attack at a mall in Baghdad this week. The European Central Bank, ECB, holds its monetary policy meeting this week, and with inflation nowhere in sight across Europe, industrial output slowing, further weakness in oil prices, and projections for further economic weakness in the Eurozone, analysts are beginning to speculate that the group could announce additional monetary stimulus measures when the meeting concludes. Crude oil prices continue to be suppressed as West Texas Intermediate crude fell below $30 a barrel this week, a 12-year low. Brent crude also fell below $30 a barrel this week as news that Western sanctions on Iran might be lifted sooner than the market expected, meaning Iranian oil will be coming back to market in the near future. Russia, battered by further declines in oil prices and continued economic sanctions over its treatment of Ukraine, may need to consider selling state banking assets, according to the Russian economy minister. According to Reuters, the minister said that the state should consider selling its holdings in the country's two largest banks, as there was a risk that low oil prices may remain for a prolonged period of time, possibly for decades. The euro drifted lower against the US dollar for most of the week, finding a floor on Wednesday, and then moving slightly higher from there. The euro saw a sharp spike on Thursday that was short-lived, but the equally sharp fall was not enough to send the euro back to its lows for the week. The euro drifted higher through Friday and appears set to close the week only slightly lower against the US dollar. The Japanese yen started the week with a sharp spike higher, but then began moving lower in fits and starts through Wednesday. The yen started moving higher on Wednesday and trended higher against the dollar in a series of peaks and valleys, and also appears set to close the week only slightly lower against the US dollar. This weekend will be another long weekend in the US, as Monday will see the observance of Martin Luther King Day, and stock markets will be closed accordingly. If China's stock market closes down drastically on Monday, then when US markets reopen on Tuesday, we could see another potential beating take place in US stocks as they process any data releases and economic events from Asia that take place over the weekend. China's slowing economy continues to play a major factor in stock market volatility both in Asia and abroad. China's economy has also had an effect on the sliding price of oil, as Asian demand has clearly tapered off. The plummet in oil prices has also been exacerbated by the news that Iranian oil will likely come back online sooner than initially projected. As oil prices continue their downward spiral, economies that are heavily dependent on crude exports are becoming increasingly desperate for cash. Russia, Venezuela, and even Saudi Arabia itself are all experiencing massive budget shortfalls as oil prices continue to plunge. Russia is rumored to be considering selling off some of its state-owned stakes in two of its largest banks to raise cash. Venezuela has been borrowing money from China for years as its oil income has dried up, and Saudi Arabia has been trying to engineer its own fundraising measures by considering taking one of its holding companies public. In the Middle East, the Islamic State is clearly making moves to extend its reach outside of Iraq and Syria by coordinating with local terrorists and terror groups on the ground in far-flung areas across the world. The recent attacks in France, the US, Jakarta, Egypt, Beirut, and Baghdad have all been claimed by the Islamic State. Jakarta's attack this week showed a high degree of sophistication and more cooperation with members of the Islamic State than has previously been seen in the region. The goal of the Islamic State is apparently to create another area of operations in Southeast Asia from which to spread their campaign of terror and destruction. Once again, as we enter a long weekend under the shadow of further stock volatility in China, it will remain extremely important to monitor global news outlets over the weekend for events which could send precious metals prices surging higher, driven by a sudden increase in demand for a safe place to store hard-earned cash as global stocks plummet. Remember that precious metals should always be viewed as a long-term investment, and that the key to profitability through the ownership of physical precious metals is to actually acquire and own the physical products, and to hold them for the long term. Always remember that you should never overextend your ability to maintain ownership of your precious metals over the long term. The Precious Metals Week in Review, January 15th, 2016. Brought to you by Precious Metals International.